My name is Sarah. I am 32 years old. And for 5 years, my parents invited our entire extended family to a beautiful, sprawling lake house for Easter Sunday, loudly bragging to everyone that they had bought it with their hard-earned retirement savings. They did not. They had not paid a mortgage in a decade. But every single spring, I was forced to play the silent hired help, serving the roast lamb, scrubbing the fine china, and refilling mimosas for 40 guests while my golden child brother tanned on the patio. Then, during dessert this year, my father stood up, clinked his champagne flute, and proudly told the entire family he was selling the property to fund my brother's failed tech startup. He looked me dead in the eye in front of 3 dozen relatives and casually gave me 30 days to pack up my room in the basement and get out. He thought he was the king of the castle. He did not know that my husband's best friend, the local county sheriff, was currently standing on the front porch, holding a legally binding document that was about to publicly humiliate my father and strip away everything he thought he controlled. Before I go on, if this story resonates with you, hit like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with it. Drop your city and local time in the comments. To understand how my parents could possess the sheer, delusional audacity to evict me from a house they did not even own, you have to understand the toxic mythology of my family. My parents, Richard and Helen, were obsessed with appearances. Growing up, our family looked like a glossy magazine cover to the outside world, but behind closed doors, we were drowning in credit card debt. My father was a man who believed he was destined for extreme wealth, but possessed absolutely none of the work ethic required to achieve it. Instead, he poured all his expectations into my younger brother, Leo. Leo was the golden child. He was handsome, charismatic, and entirely useless. My parents funded his expensive fraternity lifestyle, paid off his luxury car loans, and bailed him out of every bad business decision he ever made, convinced he was just one big break away from becoming a billionaire. I was the exact opposite. I was the invisible workhorse. I moved out at 18, put myself through accounting school, married a wonderful, grounded man named Mark, and quietly built a highly successful financial consulting firm. My parents did not care about my success unless they could use it. Which brings me to the lake house. 5 years ago, my parents' financial house of cards finally collapsed. The bank was moving to foreclose on their home. In a tearful, desperate phone call, my mother begged me to save them from the ultimate social humiliation of being homeless. Against Mark's better judgment, I stepped in. I did not just pay their arrears. My husband and I bought the house outright from the bank. We put the deed exclusively in our names, but we allowed my parents to continue living there rent-free. The only condition? My father begged me to let them save face. He asked if we could keep the financial arrangement a secret from the extended family so he would not look like a failure to his brothers. I agreed. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Within 6 months, their gratitude vanished, completely replaced by a terrifying, manufactured reality. Because I had agreed to keep the secret, my parents began to genuinely believe the house still belonged to them. Nowhere was this delusion more nauseatingly apparent than our annual Easter Sunday gathering. It was 1 in the afternoon on a gorgeous April day. The French doors of the lake house were thrown open to the wraparound porch. The air smelled of expensive roasting lamb, fresh lilies, and expensive perfume. 40 aunts, uncles, and cousins were milling about the living room, marveling at the waterfront view. "Richard, the landscaping looks absolutely incredible this year," my Uncle Dave boomed, clapping my father on the back. "Thanks, Dave," my father beamed, swirling his scotch. Helen and I put a lot of sweat equity into the garden this spring. It is tough maintaining an estate like this, but we love having the space for the family. I was standing 10 feet away in the kitchen, my hands covered in dish soap. Sweat equity. I had personally paid a landscaping crew $2,000 2 weeks prior to lay that mulch and plant those hydrangeas, while my father watched golf on television. "Sarah!" My mother's voice snapped, cutting through the chatter. Helen marched into the kitchen, her pastel floral dress perfectly pressed. She frowned at the sink. "What is taking so long with the appetizers?" "Aunt Margaret's glass is empty, and Leo is starving. Stop dawdling and bring out the crostini." She spoke to me with the clipped, impatient tone of a dissatisfied restaurant manager scolding a busboy. I wiped my hands on a towel, swallowing the heavy lump of resentment in my throat. I looked out the kitchen window. There was Leo, 28 years old, lounging on a patio chair in designer sunglasses, scrolling on his phone while I prepared a feast in a house that my husband and I paid the property taxes on. I had spent 5 years keeping the peace. 5 years shrinking myself to protect my father's fragile ego. I picked up the silver tray of appetizers. "Right away, Mom," I said quietly. I did not know it yet, but the simmering tension in my chest was about to reach a boiling point. Because my father was not just planning to serve lamb for dinner, he was planning an ambush. And the secret I had kept hidden for half a decade was about to detonate right in the middle of the dining room table. The dining room was a masterpiece of manufactured wealth. My mother had insisted on renting long banquet tables to fit all 40 guests, draping them in crisp white linens and expensive pastel centerpieces. I carried the heavy silver tray of appetizers from the kitchen, my feet aching in the sensible shoes my mother told me to wear, so I would not look unkempt in front of the extended family. The seating arrangement told you everything you needed to know about our family hierarchy. My father, Richard, sat at the head of the main table like a lord. My brother, Leo, sat immediately to his right, holding court. He was currently explaining the concept of his newest startup idea, which sounded like a confused, impossible mix of cryptocurrency and a local food delivery service. He had 0 coding experience and 0 funding. But listening to my father nod along, you would think Leo was the next tech visionary. I placed the appetizers down, and Helen immediately snapped her fingers, pointing to an empty water pitcher. I spent the next hour walking back and forth, serving the garlic-crusted roast lamb, pouring the expensive red wine they had asked me to buy, and clearing away the dirty appetizer plates. My husband, Mark, tried to help, but my mother repeatedly shooed him away. Mark sat at the far end of the secondary table, his jaw clenched tightly. He knew the absolute truth about the house. He knew we owned the very floorboards my parents were walking on, and he hated watching them treat me like hired help. I kept my head down, thinking if I just got through the meal, we could go home and leave the delusion behind. But my father had other plans. After I cleared the main course, I brought out a massive carrot cake I had baked from scratch. Richard stood up, smoothing his silk tie, and clinked a butter knife against his champagne flute. The room's chatter slowly died down. 40 expectant faces turned to look at him, waiting for whatever grand holiday toast he had prepared. "Family," my father began, his voice booming with practiced authority. "Helen and I are so blessed to have you all in our home today. When we bought this beautiful property, we dreamed of it being a legacy." He paused, letting the relatives murmur their appreciation. Uncle Dave raised his glass in a silent toast. "But legacies are about the future," Richard continued, placing a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder. "And looking at my son, I see the future. As many of you know, Leo is launching a groundbreaking tech company. It needs a serious seed investment to really get off the ground." Leo sat back, looking incredibly smug. I stood by the swinging kitchen door, feeling a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. "So," my father announced, his voice echoing across the silent room, "Helen and I have made a major decision. We have officially decided to put the property on the market next week. We are going to downsize to a condo, and we are using the equity from the sale to fully fund Leo's company." The room erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Aunt Margaret clapped loudly. Uncle Dave whistled. Everyone was completely taken in by the illusion of my parents' incredible generosity. My mother sat there dabbing her eyes with a napkin, playing the supportive matriarch perfectly. I felt the floor dropping out from underneath me. Sell the property? They did not own a single brick of this house. The deed was sitting in a fireproof safe in my home office, locked securely under my name and Mark's name. They were literally standing in a house I paid the mortgage on, announcing to 40 people they were going to sell it to give money to my lazy brother. The applause died down, and Richard turned his gaze directly toward me. The warm expression vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. This was a brutal power play. And Sarah, my father said casually, waving his hand in my direction as if swatting a fly. Since we are listing the house so soon, the realtors need to stage the basement. You have about 30 days to pack up your old bedroom down there and move your boxes out. We need the space clear. I am sure you can find a storage unit for your things. Dead silence fell over the dining room. Every relative turned to look at me, the successful older sister, being kicked out of her parents' basement so the golden child could get his millions. I looked at my mother, who refused to meet my eyes. I looked at Leo, who was grinning. And finally, I looked at Mark. My husband had half risen from his chair, his face red, ready to tear the room apart. I caught Mark's eye and gave him a tiny shake of my head. Do not say a word, I silently told him. In that exact moment, 25 years of desperate yearning for my parents' approval evaporated. The secret I had kept to protect their fragile pride meant nothing. They were willing to humiliate me and steal from me just to uphold their delusion. They thought I would stay quiet to avoid ruining Easter. I did not cry. I did not scream. A profound, icy calm washed over me. I reached into my apron and pulled out my cell phone. I clicked on the contact name for Sheriff Miller, Mark's childhood best friend. He had been parked at the end of the driveway for 20 minutes, waiting for my signal. He had the formal eviction papers in his squad car. We had drawn them up 3 days ago, right after my father foolishly bragged to me on the phone about his grand plan to list the house. I typed 2 words. Come in. I hit send. The silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. 40 pairs of eyes shifted awkwardly between me, standing by the kitchen door in my catering apron, and my father, standing at the head of the table like a benevolent king. My Uncle Dave cleared his throat, staring down at his half-eaten slice of carrot cake. Aunt Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her seat, shooting me a look of deep pity. They all believed the lie. They all thought I was a 32-year-old failure crashing in my wealthy parents' basement, being gently nudged out of the nest so the family fortune could be passed down to my visionary brother. Leo leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass with a smug grin. He actually had the nerve to give me a little mock salute. My mother, Helen, simply folded her hands in her lap, looking extremely pleased with how seamlessly they had orchestrated my public humiliation. I did not rush out of the room in tears. I did not scream that it was unfair. I just stood there, holding the silver serving tray, feeling a profound and absolute sense of freedom wash over my entire body. The heavy chains of filial obligation simply dissolved. Before the awkward silence could stretch into a full minute, the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the wraparound porch. The grand oak front door had been left wide open to let in the warm spring breeze. A tall figure stepped into the foyer, his broad silhouette blocking out the afternoon sun. It was Sheriff David Miller. He was in full uniform, his silver badge catching the light, a thick manila folder tucked securely under his arm. Dave had been Mark's best friend since middle school. He knew our family dynamic intimately, and he had been waiting for me to pull the ripcord on this charade for over 3 years. The chatter that had just begun to bubble up again instantly died. The sight of a uniformed officer walking into a private family holiday dinner tends to command absolute attention. My father, ever the arrogant host, completely misread the situation. He plastered on a wide politician smile and stepped away from his chair, opening his arms expansively as if greeting an old fan. "Officer," Richard boomed, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Is there a problem with the cars parked out on the street? I told the neighbors we would be having a large gathering today. Or perhaps you are just here to say hello to Mark? Come on in, let me get you a plate of lamb. We have plenty to spare." Sheriff Miller did not smile. He did not look at the food. He walked straight past the secondary dining table, giving Mark a brief, professional nod, and stopped directly in front of my father. "No thank you, Mr. Hayes," the sheriff said, his voice flat and carrying easily across the dead quiet room. "I am not here for the lamb, and I am not here about the parking. I am here in my official capacity to serve legal documents." My father let out a short, patronizing chuckle, completely unbothered. "Legal documents? For what? Did Leo forget to pay another parking ticket?" Sheriff Miller pulled the manila folder from under his arm and handed it directly to my father. Richard took it, still wearing that arrogant, amused smile. He flipped open the cover. I watched his eyes scan the first page. It took exactly 4 seconds for his brain to process the heavy, black legal font at the top of the document. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His jaw went slack. The smug smile evaporated entirely, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently that the paper shook in his hands. "This is a joke. This is some kind of sick joke." "It is not a joke, Richard," Sheriff Miller stated clearly, ensuring every single aunt, uncle, and cousin at the long tables could hear him. "That is a formal, court-ordered 30-day eviction notice. You and your wife are required to vacate the premises by the 1st of next month, or you will be physically removed for trespassing." My mother let out a sharp, dramatic gasp, clutching her pearl necklace. My brother Leo dropped his wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, dark red liquid pooling around his expensive loafers. "Eviction?" Uncle Dave blurted out, standing up from his chair in complete confusion. "What on earth are you talking about, officer?" "Richard owns this estate. He cannot be evicted from his own house!" Sheriff Miller turned slightly to address the room, his expression entirely stoic. "Richard and Helen Hayes do not own this property. They have not owned it for 5 years. They defaulted on their mortgage and were facing bank foreclosure." The entire dining room inhaled a collective, shocked breath. The illusion my parents had spent half a decade meticulously cultivating was being ripped away in front of their very eyes. My father looked up from the papers, his eyes wide and wild, locking onto me standing by the kitchen door. "This property," the sheriff continued, gesturing toward me and Mark, "was purchased out of foreclosure by your daughter Sarah and her husband Mark. They are the sole legal owners of the deed. They have been allowing you to live here rent-free out of the goodness of their hearts. But as of today, that arrangement has been officially terminated." I stepped forward, leaving the silver serving tray on the counter. I looked at my father, who was staring at me as if I had just sprouted horns. "You told everyone I had 30 days to pack up my room," I said, my voice steady and clear in the silent room. "But you got the names mixed up, Dad. You and Mom are the ones who have 30 days to pack. I suggest you start with the basement." The sound of Leo dropping his wine glass seemed to break a spell. The dining room, previously frozen in stunned silence, suddenly erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps, whispers, and scraped chairs. 40 relatives were processing the reality that the wealthy, generous patriarch they had been admiring all afternoon was actually a broke freeloader who had just tried to evict his own landlord. Uncle Dave was the first to speak. He looked from Richard to me, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red. "Richard," Dave demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Is this true? Did you lie to us for 5 years?" My father sputtered, his mouth opening and closing. He looked down at the legal eviction notice in his trembling hands, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. "Dave, please, it is a complicated financial arrangement," Richard stammered, the booming confidence completely gone. "Sarah and Mark are just holding the deed for tax purposes. It is still our home." Sheriff Miller did not even blink. "That is a lie," he stated flatly. "The deed, the mortgage, and the property taxes are solely in the names of Sarah and Mark Hayes. You and your wife are classified legally as month-to-month tenants with no equity, and your tenancy has been revoked." My mother, Helen, finally snapped out of her shock. She stood up, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her face contorted with rage. "How could you do this to us in front of the family?" she shrieked, completely abandoning her polite, upper-class persona. "After everything we have done for you! We gave you life! You promised you would keep this a secret!" "You are right, Mom," I replied, my voice remarkably calm. "I did promise to keep it a secret. I promised to let you save face after I spent my life savings to stop the bank from throwing you out on the street. I paid the mortgage. I paid the property taxes. I even paid for the landscaping you just took credit for. And in return, you treated me like a servant, demanded I wait on you hand and foot, and then tried to kick me out of my own house to fund Leo. The secret is over." At the mention of his name, my brother seemed to wake from a trance. The reality of the situation finally pierced through his thick layer of entitlement. Leo looked at my father, his eyes wide with rising panic. "Wait," Leo stammered, his voice cracking. "Dad, what about my seed funding? You said you were selling the house next week. You promised me $2 million for my startup! I already signed the lease for the office space!" Richard squeezed his eyes shut, looking like a man who was watching his entire life burn to the ground. He had absolutely nothing to say. Leo turned to me, his panic morphing into a desperate, frantic anger. "Sarah, you have to sell the house!" he yelled, stepping toward me. "You cannot do this! My company is going to change the world! You are ruining my life over some petty jealousy!" I looked at my 30-year-old brother, a man who had never worked a hard day in his life, throwing a tantrum because his piggy bank was suddenly empty. "I am not selling anything, Leo," I said smoothly. "But you are more than welcome to move your brilliant startup into the basement of whatever apartment Mom and Dad can afford next month. I hear you are great at raising capital. Good luck with the office lease." Aunt Margaret let out a loud, unapologetic laugh. It cut through the tension like a knife. "Good for you, Sarah," she said, raising her water glass toward me. "About time someone popped this ridiculous balloon." Sheriff Miller tipped his hat to me and Mark. "You have been officially served, Richard," the sheriff said, turning back to my father. 30 days. Do not make me come back here with a moving crew." "Have a good afternoon, folks." The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind him, but the sound echoed like a judge bringing down a gavel. My mother collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. My father stared blankly at the wall, completely destroyed by his own hubris. The extended family immediately began whispering, grabbing their purses and jackets. The lavish Easter party was over. The illusion was dead. Mark walked over and stood beside me, wrapping a warm, supportive arm around my waist. I leaned into him, feeling a massive, suffocating weight lift off my chest. I looked at the beautiful dining room, the expensive floral arrangements, and the ruined carrot cake. For the first time in 5 years, it finally felt like my home. The mass exodus from the dining room was a sight to behold. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had happily eaten my food and drank my wine for the past 5 hours suddenly remembered urgent errands they had to run. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of my parents' ruined pride. Within 20 minutes, the sprawling lake house was completely empty of guests, leaving only the 5 of us standing in the wreckage of the Easter feast. The silence was heavy. Leo was still staring at the puddle of spilled wine near his loafers, looking like a deflated balloon. My mother, Helen, had stopped her dramatic sobbing the moment the front door closed behind the last relative. She dabbed her dry eyes with a linen napkin and looked up at me. "Sarah, darling," Helen began, her voice dripping with a sudden, sickeningly sweet affection. "Let us all just take a deep breath." Tempers flared today. Things were said that people did not mean. "I meant every single word, Mom," I said smoothly. I picked up a stack of dirty dessert plates and handed them to Mark, who took them to the kitchen with a satisfied smirk. My father, Richard, cleared his throat. He smoothed his tie, desperately trying to salvage whatever scrap of authority he thought he still possessed. "Now, Sarah, let us be reasonable adults about this," he said, pacing back and forth near the head of the table. "I admit, the announcement about selling the house was a bit premature. I should have consulted you and Mark first, since your names are technically on the paperwork. But evicting your own flesh and blood? That is an extreme overreaction." "Premature?" I echoed, laughing out loud. "Dad, you stood in front of 40 people and told me I had 30 days to pack up my basement room so you could fund Leo. You did not even ask me. You just assumed I would roll over and let you steal the property I bought to save you from bankruptcy." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "It was just a misunderstanding of assets." "Look, I am a businessman. Let us make a deal. Helen and I will stay. We will even start paying you a small monthly rent. How about $500 a month? Just to keep things official. You keep the equity, we keep our home." I stared at him, absolutely baffled by his delusion. $500? The property taxes alone were triple that amount. For 5 years they had lived a millionaire lifestyle on my dime, and his grand compromise was to offer me pennies while keeping the master suite. "The answer is no," I said firmly. "The eviction stands. You have 30 days. Leo suddenly threw his hands in the air. "Are you insane?" he yelled, his voice cracking. "You are throwing our parents on the street? And what about my company? I told my investors I had $2 million in capital coming next week. They are going to sue me for breach of contract." "Then you better start looking for a real job, Leo," Mark said, walking back into the dining room. "Because this bank is officially closed. And just so we are completely clear, if any appliances, fixtures, or copper wiring go missing from this property before you move out, I will personally press charges for vandalism." Helen gasped, clutching her chest. "You are treating us like common criminals. Where are we supposed to go? We do not have any savings." "Maybe you should have thought about that before you spent 5 years buying designer clothes and hosting catered parties with my money," I replied. "You have a month to figure it out. I suggest you start packing today." I untied the catering apron from my waist and tossed it onto the dining table, right on top of my father's empty champagne flute. I grabbed my purse from the kitchen counter and took Mark by the hand. We did not wait for another desperate bargain or tearful guilt trip. We walked out the front door, leaving them standing in the mess they had made. As we walked down the driveway toward our car, the warm spring air felt cleaner, lighter. "So," Mark said, unlocking the car doors with a beep, "what are we going to do with the place?" I looked back at the sprawling lake house. It was a beautiful piece of architecture, completely ruined by my mother's tacky, pretentious decorating. First, I smiled, buckling my seatbelt. We are tearing down those hideous floral drapes in the living room. Then, we are turning Leo's old bedroom into a home gym." Mark laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed across the quiet street. "Sounds like a perfect plan." 30 days passed in a blur of frantic voicemails and desperate text messages. I blocked my mother's phone number after her 14th attempt to guilt me into paying the security deposit for their new apartment. My father tried to use his siblings to pressure me, but after the disastrous Easter dinner, Aunt Margaret and Uncle Dave refused to take his calls. The illusion was completely shattered, and my parents were finally entirely on their own. On the 1st of the month, Mark and I pulled up to the lake house at exactly 9 in the morning. The sprawling, manicured lawn was littered with cheap cardboard boxes and black trash bags. A battered yellow rental moving truck sat in the driveway, a stark and humiliating contrast to the luxury sedans my father usually leased. We did not come alone. Sheriff Miller was parked across the street in his cruiser, sipping a cup of coffee. He was off duty, but he had promised Mark he would be there to ensure the handover went smoothly and that no property was deliberately damaged on their way out. I walked up the porch steps, the wooden floorboards creaking slightly under my boots. The grand oak front door was propped open with a heavy bronze planter. I stepped into the foyer, and the sheer chaos of the scene was breathtaking. 5 years of hoarded luxury goods, designer clothes, and useless status symbols were piled haphazardly across the living room floor. Without my constant cleaning and organizing, my parents had completely crumbled under the weight of their own mess. My mother, Helen, was standing in the center of the room. She was wearing a faded tracksuit, violently taping a cardboard box shut. Her hair was a mess, and the aristocratic posture she always paraded around the family was entirely gone. She looked up and glared at me, her eyes red and puffy. "You are early," Helen snapped, her voice raspy and bitter. "We are not finished packing the kitchen. You could at least give us until noon, Sarah." "The court order said 9 in the morning, Mom," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "Mark and I are just here to do the final walkthrough. Take your time loading the truck, but we are changing the locks at 10. At that moment, Leo trudged up from the basement stairs. The golden child looked absolutely miserable. He was carrying a single, half-empty box of designer sneakers, sweating profusely. His $2 million seed funding had evaporated the second the eviction became public knowledge. Without my father's fake wealth to back him up, Leo's investors had completely abandoned him. He was now facing the terrifying reality of moving into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with our parents and getting a minimum wage job. Leo dropped the box near the door, refusing to even look at me. He just shoved his hands in his pockets and walked out to the rental truck, his grand tech visionary persona entirely destroyed. My father emerged from the master suite a moment later. Richard was carrying a heavy framed mirror, his face flushed and his breathing labored. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Mark and me standing in the foyer. The arrogant, booming patriarch who had tried to banish me to the streets just a month ago was completely gone. He just looked like a tired, defeated old man who had finally run out of other people's money to spend. "The keys are on the kitchen island," Richard muttered, strictly avoiding my eyes. He awkwardly shuffled past us, carrying the mirror out to the driveway. He did not offer an apology. He did not offer a goodbye. His pride was still the only thing he had left, even as he loaded it into the back of a rented box truck. Mark and I began our inspection. We walked through every room of the sprawling estate. The house was a mess, with scuff marks on the walls and stains on the carpets, but it was structurally intact. Mark made a specific point of checking the copper wiring in the basement and the expensive stainless steel appliances in the kitchen. Thankfully, fear of Sheriff Miller had kept my father from attempting any vindictive vandalism. By 9:45, the last black trash bag was tossed into the back of the truck. Helen stood by the passenger door, looking back at the beautiful lake house one last time. She tried to muster one final glare of motherly disappointment, but I just smiled and waved. She climbed into the cab, slamming the door shut. Richard started the engine. It sputtered loudly, coughing a cloud of gray exhaust into the pristine morning air. He put the truck in gear and slowly drove away, taking my brother and my mother away from the property they never truly owned. Mark walked up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. He handed me a brand new, shiny brass key. I locked the front door, the heavy deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying, permanent click. The silence in the house was no longer tense or awkward. It was beautiful. The sound of the rental truck fading down the street was the sweetest music I had ever heard. Mark and I stood in the foyer of the lake house, surrounded by the physical echoes of my parents' fake wealth. The floorboards were scuffed. The air smelled faintly of my mother's heavy, floral perfume, and the walls were painted a dull, lifeless beige that Richard had insisted looked aristocratic. But underneath the superficial mess, the bones of the house were incredibly strong. And more importantly, the house was finally ours. We did not waste a single minute. Mark walked straight into the main living room, grabbed the edge of the heavy, suffocating floral drapes my mother had spent a fortune on, and gave a massive pull. The fabric ripped away from the curtain rod, with a loud, satisfying tear, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The afternoon sunlight immediately flooded the room, illuminating the hardwood floors and reflecting off the sparkling water of the lake outside. It felt like the house itself was taking a deep, restorative breath. Over the next few weeks, the property underwent a complete and total exorcism. We hired a crew to rip up the stained, cream-colored carpets in the master suite, replacing them with warm, natural wood. We spent our evenings after work painting over the drab beige walls with bright, clean whites and soft coastal blues. The most satisfying project, however, was transforming my brother Leo's former bedroom. For 5 years, that room had been a shrine to his unearned ego, filled with expensive gaming setups and business books he never actually read. We stripped it down to the studs. Mark brought in heavy rubber flooring, a squat rack, and free weights. My brother's grand visionary headquarters was officially converted into a home gym, a place dedicated to actual hard work and sweat equity. Every time I lifted a dumbbell in that room, I felt a profound sense of vindication. As the physical house transformed, so did my relationship with the extended family. The fallout from the disastrous Easter dinner had rippled through the family tree like a shockwave. Without my parents' carefully constructed facade of wealth to blind them, my aunts, uncles, and cousins finally saw the reality of the dynamic. About 2 weeks into the renovation, my cell phone rang. I was sitting on the porch, covered in paint speckles. The caller ID flashed Aunt Margaret's name. I hesitated for a moment, half expecting a guilt trip, but I answered anyway. "Sarah, dear," Margaret's voice came through the speaker, sounding unusually gentle. "I am so incredibly sorry to bother you, but I felt I needed to call." "You are not bothering me, Aunt Margaret," I replied, wiping a streak of blue paint from my forehead. "What is on your mind?" She let out a heavy sigh. "Your Uncle Dave and I just wanted to apologize. We are absolutely mortified that we sat at that table for 5 years, eating your food and drinking your wine, while Richard and Helen paraded around acting like they owned the place. We should have known better. We saw how they treated you, like the hired help, and we said nothing. I am so proud of you for standing up to them." Hearing those words from the family matriarch brought tears to my eyes. For my entire life, I had been the scapegoat, the invisible daughter who was never good enough. To have my reality validated by the extended family was a profound, healing relief. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." She went on to tell me that Richard had tried to call Dave asking for a personal loan to help cover the security deposit on their cramped new apartment. Dave had flatly refused, telling my father that a man who tries to evict his own daughter does not deserve financial favors from his brothers. The family grapevine also confirmed that Leo's tech startup had officially folded. He was currently working the cash register at a local electronics store to help pay his share of the rent. Karma had not just knocked on their door. It had kicked it off the hinges. I hung up the phone and looked out at the water. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the lake. Mark walked out onto the porch holding 2 cold bottles of sparkling water. He handed one to me and sat down on the newly sanded wooden steps. "Who was that?" Mark asked, wrapping his arm around my waist. "Just Aunt Margaret," I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "She says the family is planning a summer barbecue at the local park next month. They asked if we wanted to come." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And what did you say?" I took a sip of the cold water. I told her we would love to. "But we are not bringing the appetizers." 7 months after the yellow rental truck sputtered down our driveway, the crisp autumn air settled over the lake house. It was Thanksgiving morning. For my entire adult life, this holiday had been a grueling marathon of anxiety, unpaid catering, and endless criticism from my mother. I would usually be awake by dawn, scrubbing baseboards and basting a massive turkey while Helen trailed behind me, complaining that the stuffing was too dry and my outfit was too casual. But today was entirely different. I woke up at 9 o'clock to the smell of fresh coffee and cinnamon. I walked downstairs in my comfortable flannel pajamas. The house was quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of a jazz record playing in the living room and the crackle of a fire in the hearth. Mark was standing in the kitchen, wearing an apron over his jeans, happily chopping celery and onions for his famous sausage stuffing. I poured coffee, watching my husband work. There was no screaming, no rushing, and no demands for perfection. The house finally felt like a sanctuary. By 2 in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened the heavy oak door to greet our guests, but this time, I was not opening it to a horde of entitled people expecting me to serve them. I opened it to Aunt Margaret and Uncle Dave, holding a beautiful centerpiece of autumn flowers and a freshly baked pumpkin pie. My cousins followed close behind, carrying bottles of wine and side dishes they had actually volunteered to make. "Happy Thanksgiving, Sarah," Margaret smiled warmly, pulling me into a genuine hug. "The house looks absolutely breathtaking. You and Mark have done an incredible job." We ushered everyone into the living room. The heavy floral drapes were gone, replaced by sheer linen curtains that let the afternoon sunlight pour across the new hardwood floors. There was no assigned seating. There was no strict aristocratic dress code. People sat comfortably on the plush sofas, laughing and sharing stories. I walked around offering drinks, but I was not the hired help anymore. I was the host. When Uncle Dave asked for a beer, he actually walked to the kitchen and grabbed it himself, clapping Mark on the shoulder and asking about his golf swing. It was the exact kind of effortless, loving family gathering I had always watched in movies, but never actually experienced. As we sat down at the dining room table, the contrast to that disastrous Easter dinner was impossible to ignore. The air was light. The conversation flowed easily. Of course, the elephant in the room eventually came up, but not in the tense, hushed whispers of the past. As Mark carved the turkey, my cousin Emily gently asked how my parents were handling the holidays. I did not tense up. I just took a sip of my wine and smiled. "They are having a quiet dinner at their apartment," I replied honestly. Uncle Dave shook his head, passing a bowl of mashed potatoes. "Richard called me last week. He tried to hint that they did not have enough room in their small kitchen to cook a proper turkey. He was hoping I would invite them over to my house. I told him my dining table only seats 8, and we were already full." Margaret let out a short, dry laugh. "Helen has been telling her country club friends that they decided to downsize because the lake house was simply too much maintenance for their busy lifestyle. But everyone knows the truth. Word travels fast when your son gets fired from a retail electronics store for showing up late 3 times in 1 week." "Leo lost his job?" I asked, genuinely surprised. Dave nodded grimly. He could not handle taking orders from a 20-year-old manager. He quit and is back sitting on your parents' tiny sofa, waiting for his next big idea to magically fund itself. Richard is working as a sales rep to make rent. The golden child is officially tarnished, and the king has lost his castle. I felt a brief, fleeting pang of pity, but it vanished as quickly as it arrived. They were living the exact life they had earned. Mark tapped his fork against his water glass, drawing everyone's attention. He stood up at the head of the table, looking down at me with so much pride and love it made my chest ache. "I want to make a toast," Mark said, raising his glass. "To family. Not the kind you are obligated to endure, but the kind you choose to surround yourself with. And most importantly, to my beautiful wife, Sarah. You saved this house, you broke the cycle, and you finally turned this beautiful piece of property into a real home." "Here, here," Uncle Dave echoed loudly. 40 glasses clinked together on Easter, filled with lies and manipulation. Today, only 8 glasses clinked, but they rang with absolute truth, respect, and unconditional love. I looked around the table, taking in the smiling faces of the people who truly valued me. I took a bite of my dinner, and for the first time in my life, it tasted absolutely perfect. Spring arrived at the lake house exactly 1 year after the disastrous Easter dinner. The property was in full bloom, but this time, the vibrant hydrangeas and bright yellow tulips were planted by my own hands. I was walking up the paved driveway on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, carrying a stack of mail from the antique brass mailbox Mark and I had installed by the road. Most of the pile was typical household junk, but buried at the bottom of the stack was a plain, slightly crumpled white envelope. I stopped walking. My thumb traced the familiar, sharp, cursive handwriting on the front. It was addressed to me, but my maiden name was used. Sarah Hayes, not Sarah Miller. A passive-aggressive dig before the letter was even opened. I flipped the envelope over and saw the return address. It was the low-budget apartment complex where my parents had been forced to move after their eviction. A year ago, holding a letter from my father would have sent my heart rate through the roof. My mind would have raced with suffocating anxiety, wondering what financial emergency I was expected to fund. But standing in the warm spring sun, looking at the expansive property I finally owned in both name and spirit, my heart beat at a steady, calm rhythm. I walked into the kitchen, where Mark was wiping down the granite countertops. He took one look at my face and immediately set the towel down. "What is it?" Mark asked, stepping closer. "A letter from Richard," I said, tossing the junk mail onto the kitchen island. "The first direct contact we have had in 12 months. Mark frowned, his protective instincts instantly kicking in. "You do not have to open it, Sarah. You can just throw it straight into the trash. We do not need their toxic energy brought back into this house." "I know," I replied, "but I think I really want to read it. Not because I feel guilty, but just to see if a year of harsh reality has taught him anything at all." I tore it open and unfolded a single sheet of yellow notebook paper. I read it out loud so Mark could hear every word. "Dear Sarah," the letter began. "I hope you are satisfied with how you have fractured this family. Your mother has been deeply depressed since we were forced into this tiny apartment. The neighbors are loud, the plumbing is terrible, and the heating is broken. Leo is trying his absolute best, but his brilliant ideas are being ignored by small-minded investors. We are drowning in utility bills, and my retail sales job barely covers the rent." I paused, taking a deep breath. There was zero accountability. There was no apology for trying to illegally evict me. It was just a laundry list of grievances, painting them as the ultimate victims of an unfair world. "It gets better," I told Mark, looking down at the second half of the page. "Family is supposed to help family," my father wrote. We are willing to forgive your disrespectful behavior last spring if you are willing to make things right. We know the basement at the lake house is still empty. We are willing to move back in, just temporarily, so we can save some money and help Leo get back on his feet. Do the right thing, Sarah. Call your mother." I lowered the letter. The sheer delusion of it was almost magnificent. After an entire year of struggling in the real world, my father actually thought he was offering me a gracious favor by forgiving me for his own attempted theft. Mark let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. He wants to move into the home gym? The man who tried to put you on the street wants to live in your basement? He thinks if he can just get back on the property, he can slowly take over again, I corrected softly. He thinks I am still the terrified little girl who will write a massive check just to make the silent treatment stop. "What are you going to do?" Mark asked. I looked around my beautiful, quiet kitchen. I thought about the deep respect I had finally earned from my extended family, and the heavy chains of guilt I had completely shed. I walked over to the home office door, stepped inside, and approached the heavy-duty paper shredder we kept next to the wooden desk. I flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life. I did not write a furious reply. I did not call my mother to argue. I simply dropped the notebook paper into the slot. The machine grabbed the letter, pulling my father's desperate, manipulative words through the steel blades, turning them into meaningless ribbons of white confetti. "I am going to make some lunch," I smiled, walking back into the kitchen. "Are you hungry?" Mark grinned, pulling me in for a deep kiss. Starving. The silence in the house was perfect. The final string had been cut. 2 years after the sheriff walked through my front door, the lake house was completely transformed. It was Easter Sunday once again, the anniversary of the exact day my father tried to publicly humiliate me and steal my home. But the air did not feel tense. There was no suffocating dread. The sprawling lawn was bright green, the hydrangeas were in full bloom, and the smell of roasting lamb drifted from the open kitchen windows. I stood on the wraparound porch, holding a crystal glass of sparkling cider. I watched my nieces and nephews run across the grass, hunting for brightly colored plastic eggs hidden in the flower beds. My husband Mark was manning the outdoor grill, laughing loudly at a joke Uncle Dave had just told. The driveway was full of cars, but the yellow rental moving truck was a distant memory. The people sitting on my patio furniture were not there to be served by the hired help. They were there because they genuinely wanted to celebrate the holiday with us. Aunt Margaret walked out onto the porch, holding a plate of deviled eggs. She looked radiant, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by a relaxed, joyful energy. She set the plate down on a wicker side table and stood next to me, looking out over the sparkling water. "This is perfection, Sarah," Margaret smiled, taking a deep breath of the fresh spring air. "I do not think this house has ever felt so warm and inviting. You and Mark really saved this place." "We just let it breathe," I replied, returning her smile. "It is amazing what happens when you stop trying to make everything look like a magazine cover and just let people be comfortable." Margaret nodded in agreement. She hesitated for a moment, tracing the rim of her glass. "I know we do not talk about them often," she began carefully, "but I thought you might want to know. Richard called Dave last week." I did not flinch. My heart rate stayed perfectly steady. "Oh?" I asked lightly. "How are things at the apartment?" Margaret let out a short, sad sigh. "Miserable. The rent went up, and your father's sales job is not covering the bills. Helen has completely stopped going to the country club because she is too embarrassed to be seen driving their 10-year-old used sedan. And Leo finally gave up on his tech startup delusion. He is working night shifts at a warehouse downtown. He actually asked Dave if he could move into our guest room to save money on gas." "And what did Dave say?" I asked, taking a sip of my cider. "Dave told him our guest room was currently being used to store my winter coats." Margaret laughed dryly. He told Leo that a 32-year-old man needs to learn how to pay his own rent. I looked out at the water, feeling a profound sense of closure. For my entire life, I had been terrified of my parents' disappointment. I had spent a fortune trying to buy their love, sacrificing my own peace to protect their fragile egos. But hearing about their struggles now did not fill me with guilt. It just filled me with a quiet, undeniable clarity. They built their own prison. They chose pride over their daughter. They chose a golden child over a secure future. And now, they were living in the exact reality they had created for themselves. "Are you okay?" Margaret asked softly, watching my face. "I am wonderful," I answered honestly. "I really am." Margaret patted my arm affectionately and walked back inside to check on the roast. I stayed on the porch for a few more minutes, soaking in the sunshine. Mark walked up the wooden steps, wiping his hands on a towel. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. The sounds of our family laughing and talking floated out from the open French doors. "You did it, Sarah," Mark whispered, pressing a kiss to my cheek. "You took our home back." "We took it back," I corrected him, turning around to wrap my arms around his neck. "And we are never letting it go." The cycle of generational trauma had finally been broken. The toxic expectations, the financial manipulation, and the blatant disrespect were gone forever, locked out by a shiny brass deadbolt and a court-ordered eviction. I was no longer the invisible workhorse or the scapegoat. I was the master of my own house, the author of my own peace, and the protector of my own boundaries. My parents wanted to teach me a lesson about respect and authority. They wanted to prove that they held all the cards. But in the end, the only lesson they taught me was how to walk away. I took Mark by the hand, and together we walked back inside to enjoy our family dinner. The house was loud, messy, and absolutely full of love. It was everything a home was actually supposed to be.